What happens when one of the most respected actors in cinema history sits down for what should be a simple promotional interview and discovers that the person across from him couldn't be bothered to learn even the most basic facts about his 4-decade career? What you're about to witness isn't just another awkward celebrity moment. This is a story of how Michael Strahan's ego and laziness collided with Denzel Washington's legendary professionalism, creating one of the most jaw-dropping walkouts in live television history. This is a moment that exposed the difference between celebrity and true excellence. This is the interview that became a masterclass in dignity and self-respect. This is a confrontation where a Hollywood legend taught a morning show host an unforgettable lesson about preparation, respect, and the consequences of wasting someone's time. And this is the day that Michael Strahan learned that not everyone will tolerate being disrespected on national television. The Tuesday morning began like countless others at the Good Morning America studios in New York City. Dawn light filtered to the towering windows overlooking Times Square, casting long shadows across the familiar set where millions of Americans started their day. Production assistants moved through their well-rehearsed routines, adjusting lighting rigs and testing camera angles with the practiced efficiency of people who had orchestrated hundreds of these segments before. The energy in the building carried a particular buzz of excitement. Denzel Washington was scheduled to appear as a guest, and that was always a major get for any show. 2 Academy Awards, 10 Oscar nominations, decades of iconic performances that had defined entire generations of cinema, movies that had grossed billions worldwide, and earned critical acclaim that few actors in history could match. Having Denzel Washington on your show was a privilege, an opportunity, a chance to create meaningful television. Michael Strahan sat in his chair, reviewing his notes. Or, at least, that's what it looked like from a distance. The former NFL star turned television personality had built a successful career on his charisma and easy charm, his ability to connect with guests through casual conversation, and that signature gap-tooth smile that audiences had come to love. He'd interviewed countless celebrities, hosted major events, become a recognizable face in American media. But those who worked closely with him on this particular morning might have noticed something troubling. The way he glanced at his notes seemed perfunctory, distracted. The briefing materials his producers had prepared sat largely unread. He appeared confident, comfortable, ready to rely on the same formula that had worked for him hundreds of times before. Wing it. Keep it light. Let his personality carry the conversation. What Strahan didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly understand in his comfortable bubble of morning show success, was that Denzel Washington was not the kind of guest where that approach would work. Denzel had been doing interviews since before Strahan played his first professional football game. He'd sat across from the best journalists in the world, engaged in thoughtful conversations about craft and art and the responsibility of storytelling. He could tell within 30 seconds whether someone had done their homework or was just going through the motions. And Michael Strahan had very clearly not done his homework. The audience filed into the studio with palpable excitement, their faces bright with anticipation. Many of them had grown up watching Denzel's films, had been inspired by his performances, had come hoping to hear insights from a true master of the craft. They settled into their seats, phones silenced, ready to witness what they expected would be a fascinating conversation between 2 successful men at the top of their respective fields. The makeup artists made their final adjustments backstage. Sound engineers ran through their checks one last time. Cameras were positioned perfectly to capture every angle. Everything was ready. Everything except, as it would turn out, the host himself. When Denzel finally made his entrance, the studio erupted in applause. He moved with that characteristic grace and dignity that had become his hallmark, waving to the audience with genuine warmth. At 68 years old, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had earned every accolade, every bit of respect, every moment of admiration. His suit was impeccable. His presence commanded the room without demanding it. Strahan rose to greet him with that famous smile, shaking his hand with enthusiasm, gesturing to the guest chair with the confidence of someone who believed this would be just another successful segment. They exchanged pleasantries as Denzel settled in, the audience still buzzing with excitement, completely unaware that they were about to witness something unprecedented. The cameras rolled, the segment began, and within the first 30 seconds, everyone who was paying attention knew something was about to go very, very wrong. So, Denzel, Strahan began, leaning back in his chair with casual confidence, that signature smile still in place. I gotta ask you about this new movie of yours. I mean, another drama, another serious role. Don't you ever get tired of playing the same type of character over and over again? The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. To the casual viewer, it might have seemed like an innocuous opening, maybe even a reasonable question. But to anyone who knew anything about Denzel Washington's career, to anyone who had spent even 10 minutes researching his filmography, the question revealed something deeply problematic. Michael Strahan had no idea who he was talking to. Denzel's expression shifted subtly, his eyebrows raised just a fraction of an inch, his lips pressed together slightly. He'd been in this business for 4 decades, had sat through thousands of interviews, had handled every kind of question imaginable. But something about the way Strahan phrased this particular question, something about the casual dismissiveness in his tone, immediately put him on alert. "I'm sorry," Denzel said, his voice calm, but carrying an underlying tension that anyone truly listening would catch. "What do you mean by that?" Strahan chuckled, seemingly oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, to the warning sign that had just been posted. "Come on, man. You know what I mean? The serious guy, the mentor figure, the wise character who teaches everyone lessons. It's like you're stuck in this box, you know? When's the last time we saw you do something fun? Something light?" The words landed with all the grace of a sledgehammer. Several audience members exchanged confused glances. The producers behind the cameras began to look concerned. But Strahan, riding high on his own confidence, seemed completely unaware that he just insulted one of the greatest actors of all time by suggesting his career lacked range. Denzel sat back in his chair, his hands clasping together with deliberate control. The camera captured the subtle change in his posture, the way his entire energy shifted from friendly guest to something more guarded, more careful. "Michael," he said, and there was something in the way he said the name that should have been a warning. "I've done comedies. I've done action films. I've done Shakespeare on stage. I think if you actually looked at my body of work, you'd see quite a range." It was a gentle correction, a polite way of pointing out that Strahan's premise was fundamentally flawed. A smart host would have taken a hint, acknowledged the error, and redirected. But Michael Strahan was apparently not that smart host. "Yeah, but come on," Strahan continued, his tone becoming more dismissive, more certain of his own position. "Most people know you for the same type of role. Training Day, Man on Fire, The Equalizer. It's all the same energy, isn't it?" The studio audience started to shift uncomfortably in their seats. A murmur of confusion rippled through the rows. People who had come to hear Denzel discuss his craft were instead watching their host argue with him about his own career. The producers behind the cameras were exchanging increasingly worried glances, but there was no commercial break scheduled, no easy way to cut away from what was rapidly becoming a disaster. Denzel leaned forward slightly, and anyone who knew him, anyone familiar with his work and his presence would have recognized this as a very bad sign. When Denzel Washington got quiet and leaned forward, something significant was about to happen. "Michael," he said, his voice measured and precise, "have you actually watched my films? Because what you're describing doesn't sound like someone who's familiar with my actual work." Strahan laughed it off with the confidence of someone who genuinely believed he was in control of this conversation. He waved his hand dismissively as if Denzel's concern was nothing more than professional vanity. "Of course, I've seen your movies, man. I'm just saying from an audience perspective. You know, when people think Denzel Washington, they think serious, intense guy. Maybe it's time to shake things up a bit." "Shake things up," Denzel repeated slowly, his voice getting quieter. And anyone who truly understood him knew that the quieter his voice got, the more dangerous the situation was becoming. "And what would you suggest I do to, as you put it, shake things up?" "I don't know," Strahan said with a shrug, as if he were discussing something trivial. "Maybe try some comedy. Do a romantic comedy, or something. Show people you can be funny. You know, loosen up a little bit." The condescending tone was now impossible to miss. What had started as an awkward question was evolving rapidly into something much more problematic, much more disrespectful. The studio audience was beginning to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary, and not in a good way. Denzel's jaw tightened just barely, just enough for the cameras to catch it. "Michael, I've been acting since before you started playing football. I've won 2 Academy Awards. I've been nominated for 10. I performed on Broadway. I've directed films that have been critically acclaimed and commercially successful. What exactly are you trying to say here?" Strahan seemed to sense he'd walked into something. But instead of backing down gracefully, instead of acknowledging his error and moving forward, he did what his ego apparently wouldn't let him avoid. He doubled down. "Hey, I'm not trying to attack you or anything," he said, his voice taking on a slightly defensive edge. "I'm just having conversation. This is what interviews are about, right? Asking the tough questions." The words "tough questions" seemed to echo in the studio. Denzel stared at him for a long moment, and you could practically see him making a decision, crossing some internal threshold. "Tough questions," he repeated, and there was something in his tone now that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. "Michael, a tough question would be about my preparation process, about my thoughts on the current state of cinema, about the themes I'm exploring in my upcoming projects. What you're doing is making assumptions about my career based on what sounds like a very surface-level understanding of my work." Strahan's smile faltered for just a moment, a crack appearing in his confident facade. But he quickly recovered, falling back on his television training, that ability to smooth over awkward moments with charm and deflection. "Look, I think you're taking this a little too seriously. We're just having a casual conversation here." "Casual," Denzel repeated, and the single word carried more weight than entire paragraphs could have. "So, when you have actors on your show, this is how you prepare. You just wing it and hope for the best." The question hit harder than Strahan had expected. It wasn't just a pushback anymore. It was a direct challenge to professionalism, his credibility as a host. His media training kicked in automatically, and he tried to laugh it off with that signature smile. "Come on, Denzel. You know that's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean, Michael?" Denzel's voice was steady, controlled, but carrying an edge that could cut steel. "Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you didn't bother to do any research about the person you're interviewing today." The studio fell completely silent. The playful banter, the comfortable morning show atmosphere, all of it evaporated in an instant. What everyone was witnessing now was something far more serious, far more significant than a typical interview disagreement. Strahan's face showed a flash of genuine concern as he realized this interview was spiraling completely out of his control. He glanced toward the producers off camera, a subtle plea for help, some kind of lifeline. But there was nothing they could do now. The damage was being done in real time, broadcast live to millions of viewers across the country. "I did my research," Strahan said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence, carrying a defensive quality that hadn't been there before. "I know about your career." "Do you?" Denzel asked, and the simplicity of the question somehow made it more devastating. "Because a few minutes ago you suggested I only play one type of character, which tells me you've either never actually watched my films or you're choosing to ignore the diversity of my work for some reason I can't quite understand." The audience was completely transfixed now. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was education, a masterclass in professionalism being delivered live on national television. Camera operators had stopped adjusting their equipment, standing frozen, as they captured every moment of this unprecedented confrontation. Strahan tried desperately to regain some control, to steer this back towards safer ground. "Okay, let's start over. Let's talk about your new film." "No, Michael," Denzel said firmly, and the word no seemed to reverberate through the studio. "Let's not start over. Let's finish what we started. You wanted to have a conversation about my career, so let's have it. But let's have it based on facts, not on whatever preconceived notions you walked in here with today." The tension in the studio was now thick enough to cut with a knife. Strahan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confident morning show host persona crumbling piece by piece. He was clearly realizing he'd stepped into something much bigger than he'd anticipated. But his ego, that same ego that had carried him through his football career and into television success, wouldn't let him back down gracefully. All right, Denzel. Strahan began, and his tone suggested he was about to make things significantly worse rather than better. I hear what you're saying, but you have to admit, when you look at the box office numbers, your biggest hits are all in that same wheelhouse. I mean, that's just facts, right? Denzel's eyes narrowed slightly. Just a fraction, just enough for those paying close attention to see. The camera caught it perfectly. The moment when patience finally gave way to something harder, something more dangerous. Box office numbers. Denzel said slowly, each word precisely measured. So now we're reducing artistic merit to commercial performance. I'm not reducing anything. Strahan responded, his voice getting more defensive by the second. I'm just saying the numbers don't lie. Your action movies make more money than your dramas. Michael Denzel said, leaning forward slightly, do you know what my highest grossing film is? Strahan paused, caught off guard by the direct question by being put on the spot. Probably one of the Equalizer movies. American Gangster. Denzel corrected him immediately without hesitation, which was a drama. Do you know what my most critically acclaimed performance is considered to be by most critics? Another pause. Strahan's confidence was visibly cracking now, his certainty draining away. Training Day. Many would say Fences, which I also directed, Denzel said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades mastering his craft. Or Malcolm X or The Hurricane. All dramas, Michael. All different types of characters. All different approaches to storytelling. All films that required entirely different preparation and technique. The studio audience was completely silent, now barely breathing. What they were witnessing had transcended mere entertainment. This was becoming something more significant, more profound. A lesson in professionalism, in preparation, in what it means to truly respect someone's work and legacy. Strahan tried to recover by changing tactics, attempting to move past his obvious lack of knowledge. Okay, you got me there. But look, I think what our viewers want to know is what's next for Denzel Washington. Are you going to keep doing these serious roles, or are you going to surprise us? What our viewers want to know, Denzel repeated, and there was something almost dangerous in his tone now. Something that made everyone lean forward unconsciously. Michael, how do you know what our viewers want to know? Did you survey them? Did you conduct focus groups? Did you spend any time at all thinking about what meaningful questions you might ask? Come on, you know what I mean, Strahan said weakly. No. Denzel replied with absolute finality. I don't know what you mean. And that's been the problem with this entire conversation. You keep making assumptions. You keep speaking in generalities. You keep trying to put me in boxes that don't actually exist. Boxes that only exist in your mind because you didn't take the time to learn about the reality of my work. Strahan's smile had completely disappeared. Now gone was a charming television personality, replaced by someone who looked genuinely uncomfortable. Someone beginning to understand the gravity of his mistakes. But instead of acknowledging those mistakes, instead of showing some humility, he chose to get defensive. Look, I'm just trying to have a conversation here. You're making this way more complicated than it needs to be. Complicated? Denzel's voice rose slightly. Just slightly. Just enough to make everyone in the studio take notice, to understand that something significant was happening. Michael asking an actor about their craft, their choices, their artistic process. That's not complicated. That's literally the most basic thing you could do in an interview like this. That's interview 101. I am asking about your craft. Strahan protested. No, Denzel said flatly. You're not. You're asking me to defend my career choices based on your limited understanding of what those choices have been. You're asking me to explain my work to someone who hasn't taken the time to learn about that work in the first place. There's a fundamental difference. The producers were frantically trying to figure out how to salvage this disaster. But there was no commercial break scheduled for another several minutes, and stopping the interview now would be even more embarrassing than letting it continue. They were trapped, forced to watch as their host's credibility crumbled in real time. Strahan took a deep breath, clearly trying to reset the conversation to find some way back to safer ground. But his next words demonstrated that he still didn't understand the depth of the hole he dug himself into. Okay, let me ask you this. If you could give advice to young actors coming up today, What would you tell them about choosing roles? I'd tell them to work with people who respect their intelligence and their craft. Denzel responded immediately, and the implication hung heavy in the air like smoke from a fired gun. That's good advice, Strahan said, apparently missing or choosing to ignore the subtle insult entirely. And I guess they should also think about commercial appeal, right? I mean, at the end of the day, this is a business. Denzel stared at him for a long moment. The silence stretched uncomfortably, painfully long. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried crystal clarity to every corner of the studio. Michael, do you think I don't understand that this is a business? I didn't say that, Strahan replied quickly. You implied it, Denzel said, his voice gaining strength. Just like you've been implying throughout this entire interview, that I somehow stumbled into success without understanding my own career, that I've been making choices for 4 decades without comprehending the commercial realities of the industry, that I need you, Michael Strahan, to explain to me how Hollywood works. Strahan realized with dawning horror that he was losing control of the narrative completely, that this interview had become something he never intended, something he couldn't stop. That's not what I meant at all, he said desperately. Then what did you mean? Denzel's question was simple, direct, impossible to deflect. Because I've been sitting here for 15 minutes listening to you tell me about my own career, my own choices, my own artistic process, as if I haven't been living it for the past 4 decades. As if I'm somehow unaware of my own life's work. The camera captured every micro-expression on both men's faces. Straw looked like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him. Denzel looked like a man who had reached the absolute end of his patience, with someone who had clearly wasted his time. I think there might be a misunderstanding here. Strahan tried weakly, grasping at straws. There's no misunderstanding, Michael. Denzel's voice was firm. Final. The understanding is crystal clear. You came into this interview with a set of assumptions about who I am and what my career has been. And rather than asking questions to learn something new, rather than showing curiosity about someone with decades of experience, you spent our time together trying to get me to confirm your preconceptions. Strahan glanced desperately toward the cameras, then back at Denzel, clearly hoping for some kind of rescue that wasn't coming. The producers couldn't help him. His co-hosts couldn't help him. He was completely, utterly alone in this disaster of his own making. I was just trying to have an engaging conversation, he said. And even he didn't sound convinced by his own words. Engaging for whom? Denzel asked. Because from where I'm sitting, this feels more like you're trying to prove some point that only makes sense to you. Like you're more interested in hearing yourself talk than in actually learning anything about the person you invited onto your show. The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Everyone present knew they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be talked about for years. This wasn't just a difficult interview anymore. This was a complete breakdown of professional courtesy, of basic respect, of the fundamental contract between host and guest. Look, maybe we should talk about your new movie, Strahan suggested desperately, trying one more time to redirect this runaway train. Maybe we should, Denzel agreed. And for just a moment, Strahan looked hopeful. Then Denzel continued. But first, maybe you should tell me what it's about since you've done your research. Strahan's face went pale. The blood literally drained from his features as he realized what Denzel had just done. He'd called his bluff, exposed the fundamental truth that had been lurking beneath this entire disaster. And Strahan's expression, the way his mouth opened and closed without sound, the panic in his eyes, it told everyone in the studio and everyone watching at home everything they needed to know. Michael Strahan had no idea what Denzel Washington's new movie was about. Well, it's a drama, right? Strahan said weakly, desperately, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. Denzel didn't respond immediately. He simply sat there looking at Strahan with an expression that somehow managed to be both disappointed and utterly unsurprised at the same time. The silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second, each tick of the clock, until it became abundantly clear to everyone that Denzel was not going to help Strahan out of this hole he dug for himself. The silence became unbearable, suffocating. Strahan's desperation started to show more openly now, as he realized he'd been caught completely, utterly unprepared. He glanced at his notes, shuffling through papers on the table as if the answer might magically appear. But it was too late. The damage was catastrophic, and everyone watching knew it. It's about Strahan started then stopped, clearly stalling for time. It deals with some heavy themes, right? Denzel's expression didn't change. He simply continued to stare at Strahan, waiting with the patience of someone who had already made up his mind about what would happen next. The camera captured every uncomfortable second as it became increasingly painfully obvious that the host had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. "Michael," Denzel finally said, his voice so quiet that everyone in the studio had to lean in to hear him. "How long have you known you were going to interview me today?" "What do you mean?" Strahan asked, confusion mixing with his panic. "It's a simple question." Denzel's tone was measured precise. "How long have you known I was going to be your guest?" Strahan shifted nervously in his seat, his body language screaming discomfort. "Well, these things are scheduled weeks in advance." "Weeks?" Denzel repeated, and he let the word hang in the air. "So, you've had weeks to prepare for this conversation, weeks to learn about my work, weeks to come up with thoughtful questions. And this," he gestured vaguely at the space between them, "this is what you came up with." The question wasn't really a question. It was an indictment, a verdict delivered with devastating simplicity. Strahan tried desperately to deflect, to find some way out. "Look, sometimes the best interviews are the ones that feel natural, conversational." "Natural," Denzel said, and there was something in his tone that made everyone in the studio tense up even more. "Michael, there's nothing natural about asking someone about their career without bothering to learn what that career actually consists of. There's nothing conversational about wasting someone's time with assumptions and generalizations." "I know your career," Strahan protested weakly. "Do you?" Denzel leaned forward slightly. "Then tell me about my new film. Tell me what it's about. Tell me who I play. Tell me who directed it. Tell me anything, literally anything at all, that shows me you spent even 5 minutes preparing for this interview." Strahan's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The seconds ticked by, each one more painful than the last, and his silence spoke louder than any words could have. The entire studio was watching a man realize that his professional reputation was crumbling in real time, broadcast live to millions of viewers. "This is ridiculous," Strahan finally said, his frustration boiling over, his embarrassment morphing into defensiveness. "I don't need to prove anything to you. I'm the host here." The words hit the studio like a thunderclap. If there had been any chance, any slim possibility of salvaging this interview, Strahan had just destroyed it completely and irrevocably. Denzel's eyebrows raised slightly, and for the first time since this disaster began, he actually looked surprised. Not upset, not angry, just genuinely taken aback by the sheer audacity of what he just heard. "You're the host," Denzel repeated slowly, as if tasting the words, testing their weight. "And what exactly do you think that means?" "It means I ask the questions, you answer them," Strahan said, some of his bravado returning now that he'd committed to this disastrous course. "That's how this works." Denzel stared at him for a long moment, and everyone watching could see something shift in his eyes, some final decision being made. Then he slowly shook his head, and the gesture carried more disappointment than 1,000 words could have conveyed. "No, Michael," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying absolute authority. "Being the host means you have a responsibility to your guests and to your audience. It means you come prepared. It means you show respect for the people who take time out of their lives to be here. It means you understand that your platform is a privilege, not a right." "I am showing respect," Strahan protested. "Are you?" Denzel's voice was getting stronger now, more forceful, more direct. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you think you can wing it. Like my time doesn't matter. Like my work doesn't matter enough for you to spend an hour, one single hour learning about it before I walk through that door." Strahan's face was turning red now, embarrassment and anger mixing in equal measure. "That's not fair." "What's not fair, Michael?" Denzel said, his voice rising slightly. "Is bringing someone onto your show and then wasting their time with lazy questions and baseless assumptions." What's not fair is having a platform like this with millions of viewers and not taking it seriously. What's not fair is treating your guests like props in your performance instead of people deserving of respect. The studio audience was completely captivated now, hanging on every word. This had transcended entertainment entirely. This was a lesson in professionalism, in dignity, in what it means to truly respect someone's work and legacy. A lesson being broadcast, lived to millions of people. "Look, I think you're overreacting," Strahan said. And immediately, instantly, everyone in the studio knew he had made another massive, irredeemable mistake. Denzel went completely still when he spoke. His voice was deadly calm, the kind of calm that comes right before a storm. "I'm overreacting." Strahan seemed unable to stop himself from making it worse. "This is just a morning show interview. It's not that serious." "Not that serious," Denzel repeated. And each word carried the weight of 4 decades of experience, of dedication, of craft. "Michael, do you know how many people watch this show?" "Of course I do," Strahan replied. But his voice had lost all its confidence. "Do you know how many young actors are watching right now?" Denzel's voice was gaining power, intensity. "Seeing how you treat someone with 4 decades of experience in this industry. Do you know how many students, how many aspiring filmmakers, how many people who dream of doing what I do are watching this and learning that this is how interviews are conducted, that this is a level of respect they can expect?" The camera captured Strahan's face as Denzel's words hit home, as he began to understand, perhaps for the first time, that this wasn't just about one bad interview anymore. This was about something larger, something more significant. This was about the message being sent to an entire generation of artists and performers. "I didn't think about it that way," Strahan admitted quietly, some of his defensiveness finally cracking. "No," Denzel said simply. "You didn't think at all. And that's the problem." Then Denzel Washington did something that would be replayed on television and social media for years to come. He stood up slowly, deliberately, with the same careful precision he brought to everything he did. The movement was simple, but everyone watching understood its significance immediately. "Michael, I've been doing interviews for longer than you've been on television," Denzel said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned studio. "I've sat with journalists who challenged me, who pushed me, who asked tough questions that made me think deeply about my work and my choices. That's what good interviews do. They illuminate, they educate, they create meaningful dialogue." Strahan looked up at him, finally understanding that this was really happening, that his guest was about to walk out on live television. "Denzel, please," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine panic. "Now, let's just what this is," Denzel continued, not letting him finish. His voice firm and unwavering is disrespectful to me, to your audience, and to the craft that I've dedicated my entire life to, and I won't be part of it. He reached with a small microphone clipped to his shirt and removed it with the same careful precision he brought to every movement, every gesture. The action was simple, just unclipping a microphone, but everyone watching understood that it represented so much more. It was a line being drawn, a stand being taken, a refusal to accept being treated as less than he deserved. "I came here today," Denzel said as he carefully placed a microphone on the coffee table between them, "to talk about my work, about storytelling, about the themes that matter to me, about the craft that I love. But I won't sit here and be lectured about my own career by someone who couldn't be bothered to spend 10 minutes learning about the person he was going to interview." Strahan half rose from his chair, his hand reaching out in a gesture that was part plea, part desperation. "Denzel, wait. We can fix this. We can start over." "Fix what, Michael?" Denzel's voice was steady, calm, final. "The fact that you came unprepared. The fact that you spent the last 20 minutes making assumptions about my work based on ignorance. The fact that when I called you out on it, you told me I was overreacting." He straightened his jacket with careful dignity, the gesture somehow making him seem even more composed, even more professional than he had at the start of this disaster. "I've been in this business long enough to know when someone respects what I do and when they don't. Today, Michael, you made it very, very clear which category you fall into." Strahan finally stood up completely, but it was far too late. The moment had passed. The decision had been made. Denzel was already turning toward the exit, his posture straight, his pace unhurried, but absolutely determined. "Denzel, please." Strahan called out one last time, his voice carrying a note of desperation that anyone watching could hear. "Don't do this." But Denzel didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the plea, didn't pause in his movement. He simply continued walking, his head held high, his dignity fully intact until he disappeared from view through the studio exit. The camera stayed on Strahan, capturing his face as he stood there alone beside his empty chair, the reality of what had just happened beginning to sink in. He looked lost, humiliated, like a man who had just learned an expensive lesson about respect and preparation in the most public way imaginable. The studio remained in shocked silence. The audience sat frozen, unsure how to react. The crew members stood at their stations, cameras still rolling, capturing every second of this unprecedented moment. And through it all, one thing was absolutely clear to everyone watching. They had just witnessed one of Hollywood's most legendary actors walk out a live television interview because the host, the person whose job it was to create meaningful conversation, couldn't be bothered to show basic professional respect. What started as a routine promotional segment had become something else entirely, a moment that would be studied in journalism, schools, and media classes, a demonstration of what happens when ego and laziness collide with excellence and professionalism, a reminder that respect is earned, not given, and that some people like Denzel Washington, have every right to demand it. The question that lingered in that studio, that dominated conversations for weeks afterward, was painfully simple. Was Denzel right to walk out? Should he have stayed and tried to salvage something from this disaster? But for anyone who truly understood what had transpired, for anyone who had witnessed the casual disrespect and the stunning lack of preparation, the answer was obvious. Denzel Washington had done exactly what he should have done. He had drawn a line. He had stood up for his work, his legacy, and his time. He had refused to accept being treated as anything less than the accomplished professional he had spent 4 decades becoming. And Michael Strahan, he learned a lesson that day that no amount of media training could have taught him, that charm and charisma are no substitute for preparation and respect, and that some people, the truly great ones, will simply walk away rather than tolerate being disrespected on national television. The cameras finally cut away, but the moment was captured forever, preserved in high definition for anyone who wanted to see what dignity looks like, what professionalism means, and what happens when someone finally says enough to behavior that should never have been acceptable in the first place.